Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We turn in our sophomore hymnals to page 137, the Anita Desai text, Games at Twilight. I want to though take you back I want to take you back really quickly, if I could please, to page 115. Go there quickly and recognize it to be that we are messing around with this topic, conflict and resolution. And by that we mean, of course, that we have a struggle, we have a fight. The conflict can either be external or it can be internal, yes? And we also have this issue of resolution, how the conflict comes to its final resolution at the end of the story. We're going to pay attention in this text to the ways in which that happens. Hey, remember on 136, make sure you know these vocab words in time for our assessment work that we want to be doing, yes? Let's meet Anita Desai, who, by the way, you will see again in your senior year with a text called Devoted Son. If you want to take a look at that text after you finish with Games at Twilight and you like this story, you can take a look in the Senior B folder at learnstrong.net. Let's meet Anita Desai, born in 1937. Anita Desai was born in India to a German mother, Indian father. As a child, she learned German, Hindi, and English. Today, Desai writes in English, is widely regarded as one of India's foremost novelists. Family and familiarity. Desai's stories are often about the relationships among family members, in the words of one critic, quote, the tug and pull of Indian family life, end quote. Desai has been praised for her ability to create vivid portraits of her characters and for her powerful images. Anita Desai published her first story at the age of 9. For the background for this story, Games at Twilight, India's hot season. Games at Twilight is set in India during the 1940s, a time and a place in which air conditioning is unknown. From the story's first sentence, you can almost feel the heat of India's hot season rising off the page. The hot season is one of the three main South Asian seasons, falling between the wet season and the cool season. The hot season lasts from early March to mid-June. All right, let's turn now to 139 and begin our story. Again, the challenge for you is to conquer monkey mind and follow along with the reading. Again, in the sophomore year, we have these longer readings, as we have said earlier about other readings. The challenge is to be able to stay focused throughout the entire reading in our preparation for the kinds of assessments that you will be seeing, not only your sophomore year, but obviously culminating in your junior year with the ACT. All right, let's pay attention now. Follow along. Let's enjoy a story here. Games at Twilight, Anita Desai.
Games at Twilight by Anita Desai. It was still too hot to play outdoors. They had had their tea, and they had been washed and had their hair brushed, and after the long day of confinement in the house that was not cool, but at least a protection from the sun, the children strained to get out. Their faces were red and bloated with the effort, but their mother would not open the door. Everything was still curtained and shuttered in a way that stifled the children, made them feel that their lungs were stuffed with cotton wool, and their noses with dust. And if they didn't burst out into the light and see the sun and feel the air, they would choke.
140.
Please, Ma, please, they begged. We'll play in the veranda and porch. We won't go a step out of the porch. You will, I know you will. And then, no, we won't, they wailed so horrendously that she actually let down the bolt of the front door so that they burst out like seeds from a crackling, overripe pod into the veranda, with such wild, maniacal yells that she retreated to her bath and the shower of talcum powder and the fresh sari that were to help her face the summer evening. They faced the afternoon. It was too hot, too bright. The white walls of the veranda glared stridently in the sun. The bougainvillea hung about it, purple and magenta in livid balloons. The garden outside was like a tray made of beaten brass, flattened out on the red gravel and the stony soil in all shades of metal, aluminum, tin, copper, and brass. No life stirred at this arid time of day. The birds still drooped like dead fruit in the papery tents of the trees. Some squirrels lay limp on the wet earth under the garden tap. The outdoor dog lay stretched as if dead on the veranda mat, his paws and ears and tail all reaching out like dying travelers in search of water. He rolled his eyes at the children, two white marbles rolling in the purple sockets begging for sympathy, and attempted to lift his tail in a wag, but could not. It only twitched and lay still. Then, perhaps roused by the shrieks of the children, a band of parrots suddenly fell out of the eucalyptus tree, tumbled frantically in the still, sizzling air, then sorted themselves out into battle formation and streaked away across the white sky. The children, too, felt released. They, too, began tumbling, shoving, pushing against each other, frantic to start. Start what? Start their business. The business of the children's day, which is play. Let's play hide and seek. Who'll be it? You be it. Why should I? You be. You're the eldest. That doesn't mean... The shoves became harder. Some kicked out. The motherly Mira intervened. She pulled the boys roughly apart. There was a tearing sound of cloth, but it was lost in the heavy panting and angry grumbling, and no one paid attention to the small sleeve hanging loosely off a shoulder. Make a circle, she shouted, firmly pulling and pushing till a kind of vague circle was formed.
141.
Now clap, she roared. And clapping, they all chanted in melancholy unison, dip, 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 my blue ship. And every now and then one or the other saw he was safe by the way his hands fell at the crucial moment, palm on palm, or back of hand on palm, and dropped out of the circle with a yell and a jump of relief and jubilation. Raghu was it. He started to protest, to cry, "You cheated! Mira cheated! Anu cheated!" But it was too late. The others had all already streaked away. There was no one to hear when he called out, "Only in the veranda, the porch. Ma said to stay in the porch." No one had stopped to listen. All he saw were their brown legs flashing through the dusty shrubs, scrambling up brick walls, leaping over compost heaps and hedges. And then the porch stood empty in the purple shade of the bougainvillea, and the garden was as empty as before. Even the limp squirrels had whisked away, leaving everything gleaming, brassy, and bare. Only small Manu suddenly reappeared, as if he had dropped out of an invisible cloud or from a bird's claws, and stood for a moment in the center of the yellow lawn, chewing his finger and near to tears as he heard Raghu shouting, with his head pressed against the veranda wall, 83, 85, 89, 90, and then made off in a panic, half of him wanting to fly north, the other half counseling south. Raghu turned, just in time to see the flash of his white shorts and the uncertain skittering of his red sandals, and charged after him with such a blood-curdling yell that Manu stumbled over the hosepipe, fell into its rubber coils, and lay there weeping. "I won't be it.
142.
You have to find them all. All. "I know I have to, idiot," Raghu said, superciliously kicking him with his toe. "You're dead," he said with satisfaction, licking the beads of perspiration off his upper lip, and then stalked off in search of worthier prey, whistling spiritedly so that the hiders should hear and tremble.
All right, let's pause for a moment, write it down at level 1. The story begins fairly simply. Let's say two things. 1, we are, of course, in India in the hot season. It is hot. Squirrels lying unmoving. The dog lying unmoving. Note, interestingly, it's the children who want to go out and play in this insane heat. The game that they play, number 2, is of course hide and seek, yes? And so they're going to play this game of hide and seek. To this point, that's all that we know about the story. We've got a bit of setting. We've got a character that we've been introduced to in Raghu. But other than that, not a lot going on here. Again, the title of the story, Games at Twilight. We'll begin to ask as we get into this, what exactly is going on, all right? Okay, let's now pay attention and see what happens next. Next movement in our story.
Ravi heard the whistling and picked his nose in a panic, trying to find comfort by burrowing the finger deep into that soft tunnel. He felt himself too exposed, sitting on an upturned flower pot behind the garage. Where could he burrow? He could run around the garage if he heard Raghu come, around and around and around. But he hadn't much faith in his short legs when matched against Raghu's long, hefty, hairy footballer legs. Ravi had a frightening glimpse of them as Raghu combed the hedge of crotons and hibiscus, trampling delicate ferns underfoot as he did so. Ravi looked about him desperately, swallowing a small ball of snot in his fear. The garage was locked with a great heavy lock, to which the driver had the key in his room, hanging from a nail on the wall under his work shirt. Ravi had peeped in and seen him still sprawling on his string cot in his vest and striped underpants, the hair on his chest and the hair in his nose shaking with the vibrations of his phlegm-obstructed snores. Ravi had wished he were tall enough, big enough to reach the key on the nail, but it was impossible, beyond his reach for years to come. He had sidled away and sat dejectedly on the flower pot. That, at least, was cut to his own size. But next to the garage was another shed with a big green door also locked. No one ever knew who had the key to the lock. That shed wasn't opened more than once a year when Ma turned out all the old broken bits of furniture and rolls of matting and leaking buckets, and the white anthills were broken and swept away and flit sprayed into the spider webs and rat holes, so that the whole operation was like the looting of a poor, ruined, and conquered city. The green leaves of the door sagged. They were nearly off their rusty hinges. The hinges were large and made a small gap between the door and the walls, only just large enough for rats, dogs, and possibly Ravi to slip through. Ravi had never cared to enter such a dark and depressing mortuary of defunct household goods, seething with such unspeakable and alarming animal life.
143.
As Ragu's whistling grew angrier and sharper and his crashing and storming in the hedge wilder, Ravi suddenly slipped off the flower pot and through the crack and was gone. He chuckled aloud with astonishment at his own temerity, so that Ragu came out of the hedge, stood silent with his hands on his hips, listening, and finally shouted, "I heard you, I'm coming, got you," and came charging round the garage only to find the upturned flower pot, the yellow dust, the crawling of white ants in a mud hill against the closed shed door. Nothing. Snarling, he bent to pick up a stick and went off, whacking it against the garage and shed walls as if to beat out his prey. Ravi shook, then shivered with delight, with self-congratulation, also with fear. It was dark, spooky in the shed. It had a muffled smell as of graves. Ravi had once got locked into the linen cupboard and sat there weeping for half an hour before he was rescued. But at least that had been a familiar place and even smelled pleasantly of starch.
144.
And reassuringly of his mother. But the shed smelled of rats, anthills, dust, and spider webs. Also of less definable, less recognizable horrors. And it was dark. Except for the white-hot cracks along the door, there was no light. The roof was very low. Although Ravi was small, he felt as if he could reach up and touch it with his fingertips. But he didn't stretch. He hunched himself into a ball so as not to bump into anything, touch or feel anything. What might there not be to touch him and feel him as he stood there trying to see in the dark? Something cold or slimy like a snake. Snakes! He leapt up as Ragu whacked the wall with his stick, then, quickly realizing what it was, felt almost relieved to hear Ragu hear his stick. It made him feel protected. But Ragu soon moved away. There wasn't a sound once his footsteps had gone around the garage and disappeared. Ravi stood frozen inside the shed. Then he shivered all over. Something had tickled the back of his neck. It took him a while to pick up the courage to lift his hand and explore. It was an insect, perhaps a spider, exploring him. He squashed it and wondered how many more creatures were watching him, waiting to reach out and touch him, the stranger.
All right, let's jot it down really quickly. This story plays on what fears that are childhood fears. Jot it down. This story plays on some of the most ancient fears to be put in a situation where you don't know where you are, it's creepy, and it's dark. And of course, if you're in India, you know two things absolutely for sure in this shed most of the year. One, of course, is snakes. Remember, India is the place where huge snakes like king cobras live. And the second, of course, is spiders. Snakes and spiders, for many, many children, is the worst imaginable fear. And when you add to that darkness, whoa. So here he is in the shed, all of these weird things, right? Did I feel something on the back of my neck? At 3B, jot it down. When was the last time you were in a similar situation in your remembrance? When was the last time you were in a similar freaky, scary kind of situation? Can you remember how old you were? Can you kind of remember where you were? Was it dark? Did darkness have anything to do with it at all? Of course, reading a story like this takes us back in time to when we ourselves were maybe children playing similar kinds of games. All right, let's keep going. Wonder what happens next. Again, great stories, as we said before. Great texts challenge you to predict. What do you think is going to happen next? Let's imagine what's going to happen maybe next.
There was nothing now. After standing in that position, his hand still on his neck, feeling the wet splodge of the squashed spider gradually dry, for minutes, hours, his legs began to tremble with the effort, the inaction. By now he could see enough in the dark to make out the large, solid shapes of old wardrobes, broken buckets, and bedsteads piled on top of each other around him. He recognized an old bathtub. Patches of enamel glimmered at him, and at last he lowered himself onto its edge. He contemplated slipping out of the shed and into the fray. He wondered if it would not be better to be captured by Ragu and be returned to the milling crowd, as long as he could be in the sun, the light, the free spaces of the garden, and the familiarity of his brothers, sisters, and cousins. It would be evening soon. Their games would become legitimate. The parents would sit out on the lawn on cane basket chairs and watch them as they tore around the garden or gathered in knots to share a loot of mulberries or black tea-splitting jamun from the garden trees. The gardener would fix the hose pipe to the water tap, and water would fall lavishly through the air to the ground, soaking the dry yellow grass and the red gravel and arousing the sweet, the intoxicating scent of water on dry earth, that loveliest scent in the world. Ravi sniffed for a whiff of it. He half rose from the bathtub. Then he heard the despairing scream of one of the girls as Ragu bore down upon her.
145.
There was the sound of a crash and of rolling about in the bushes, the shrubs. Then screams and accusing sobs of, "I touched the den, you did not, I did, you liar, you did not," and then a fading away and silence again. Ravi sat back on the harsh edge of the tub, deciding to hold out a bit longer. What fun if they were all found and caught, he alone left unconquered. He had never known that sensation. Nothing more wonderful had ever happened to him than being taken out by an uncle and bought a whole slab of chocolate all to himself, or being flung into the soda man's pony cart and driven up to the gate by the friendly driver with the red beard and pointed ears. To defeat Ragu, that hirsute, hoarse-voiced football champion, and to be the winner in a circle of older, bigger, luckier children, that would be thrilling beyond imagination. He hugged his knees together and smiled to himself almost shyly at the thought of so much victory, such laurels.
All right, let's pause for a moment. Write it down at level 1. What's the central conflict going on here for Ravi? Well, obviously it's, what do? Do I go ahead and step out and get caught? Or do I decide to stay here in the darkness? It's kind of freaky, and maybe I can be undiscovered. I can be the conquered one. I can be the unconquerable one. I can be the winner. I can be the victor, if you will. He thinks maybe that's the ideal for him. We're now on page 146. He sits there smiling. Obviously, the question is, how's this story going to end? Like, where is a story like this going? Let's take a look.
There he sat smiling, knocking his heels against the bathtub, now and then getting up and going to the door to put his ear to the broad crack and listening for the sounds of the game, the pursuer and the pursued, and then returning to his seat with the dogged determination of the true winner, a breaker of records, a champion. It grew darker in the shed as the light at the door grew softer, fuzzier, turned to a kind of crumbling yellow pollen that turned to yellow fur, blue fur, gray fur, evening, twilight, the sound of water gushing, falling, the scent of earth receiving water, slaking its thirst in great gulps and releasing that green scent of freshness, coolness. Through the crack, Ravi saw the long purple shadows of the shed and the garage, lying still across the yard. Beyond that, the white walls of the house. The bougainvillea had lost its lividity, hung in dark bundles that quaked and twittered and seethed, with masses of homing sparrows. The lawn was shut off from his view. Could he hear the children's voices? It seemed to him that he could. It seemed to him that he could hear them chanting, singing, laughing. But what about the game? What had happened? Could it be over? How could it, when he was still not found? It then occurred to him that he could have slipped out long ago, dashed across the yard to the veranda, and touched the den. It was necessary to do that to win. He had forgotten. He had only remembered the part of hiding and trying to elude the seeker. He had done that so successfully. His success had occupied him so wholly that he had quite forgotten that success had to be clinched by that final dash to victory and the ringing cry of "Den!" With a whimper, he burst through the crack, fell on his knees, got up and stumbled on stiff, benumbed legs across the shadowy yard, crying heartily by the time he reached the veranda, so that when he flung himself at the white pillar and bawled, "Den! Den! Den!" his voice broke with rage and pity at the disgrace of it all, and he felt himself flooded with tears and misery.
147.
Out on the lawn, the children stopped chanting. They all turned to stare at him in amazement. Their faces were pale and triangular in the dusk. The trees and bushes around them stood inky and sepulchral, spilling long shadows across them. They stared, wondering at his reappearance, his passion, his wild animal howling.